What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. This is your host, Brandon DeCruz, and today is episode 90, where we're going to discuss the benefits of fueling yourself throughout the day, breaking down the data on within day energy availability, how fasted training and fasting impacts muscle growth, and the benefits of eating breakfast. And as I'm recording this, this is actually the morning of Christmas Day. And I'm early before my family to get this recording in for the week. So, although this episode will officially drop after Christmas, I just want to wish all of you out in the audience an incredible Christmas holiday and a happy New Year. Before we get into today's podcast, I do want to read out a few recent reviews that we received on iTunes. I want to give a shout out to the real Luke Skywalker, who said, "These guys do a great job with breaking down stuff for noobs. I really enjoy how Brandon loads his content with fact-based information. Jeff chimes in and often asks him the very questions I'm thinking. I'm new to fitness. I'm a 38-year-old dad with an office job. Jeff and Brandon, if you read this, you guys are awesome and your podcasts are super helpful. Thanks for putting the time and effort into these shows. I really enjoyed episodes 62 and 63, where you guys focus on the importance of sleep. Super legit. I enjoy hearing a bit about what's going on in your personal life and business. Relationships are what life is all about. It makes this show feel genuine and like you guys are actual buddies of mine. Keep up the great work." So, Luke, thank you so much, my man. And then I have one more from Georgie Cam, which said, "I love listening to these guys. I've learned so much on my fitness journey, and I listen to some of them more than once to really absorb the content-rich episodes. They keep it interesting and simple enough for me to understand. Truly appreciative for the time and research they put into this podcast." So, to both of you guys, thank you so much for the feedback. But now we're going to get on to today's show, because today I have a compressed time window with the holiday being here. And so no updates for this week, but I will get back to those next week and give you guys a little recap of what's going on in my personal life and business. And then also, what's looking ahead for 2024. And so to start us off, we're going to go through an intro to today's topic around the importance of properly fueling yourself. So, in the last two episodes of the show, I've covered the downsides and drawbacks of chronic dieting and consistently underfueling yourself, and why, if you truly want to better your body composition by gaining muscle and losing fat, you need to focus on breaking the cycle of chronic dieting and focus on spending the majority of the year in a properly fueled state so that you can reverse the diet induced metabolic adaptations of chronic calorie restriction. You can upregulate your metabolism and put yourself in a position where you're able to build muscle and metabolic resilience so that when you do decide to diet and go after the goal of fat loss in the future, you're in a better position to do so and can actually respond to the deficit you create instead of just continually and constantly trying to force your body into a deficit when you're not in the right state, whether that be physically or mentally, to do so. And it's important to realize that your metabolism adapts to what you feed it and is always changing and adjusting based on a variety of factors, including how much you eat and whether you're eating in a deficit, at maintenance, or in a surplus, the macronutrient composition of your diet, what food sources make up your daily diet, how frequently and how hard you train, how active you are on a daily basis, how well you sleep, your stress levels, among many other physiological and psychological factors. And a good way to look at your metabolism is as a thermometer, which reads and interprets the different inputs and outputs within your diet, your training, your activity levels, and your overall lifestyle. So, as your inputs and outputs change, whether that be your dietary approach, your training programming, your physical activity levels, your stress levels, and your sleep quality and quantity, so does the internal state of your metabolism and how it processes the food you're taking in and how effectively it burns calories. And our metabolisms are extremely responsive, reactive, and adaptive, especially to what we feed it, which is why after a long fat loss phase, the calorie intake you can consume and need to consume to now maintain your new lower body weight is usually significantly lower than your maintenance calorie intake was prior to starting the diet, when you were a bigger, heavier individual who was carrying more body fat and more body mass in general. And this is due to the many metabolic adaptations that come along with dieting, as well as the fact that you're now a lighter, leaner individual, which in and of itself lowers your resting metabolic rate and the total amount of calories you burn per day. And one common mistake I see many make is they're constantly trying to diet. And eventually they find themselves, they find that they're less and less responsive to creating a deficit over time. So it becomes more and more difficult for them to actually drop body fat effectively and attain a leaner physique. And this can be due to a multitude of reasons. But one of the main reasons is because they don't periodize their approach to fat loss, and they never commit to eating at maintenance or a bit above maintenance for a prolonged period of time, which if they were to do, they would see that their next fat loss phase would go much smoother than it is currently. So on today's podcast, I'm going to cover why you should be fueling yourself throughout the day as many will go to extreme lengths to try to lose weight, such as skipping meals, training fasted, and underfueling themselves in order to lose weight. But they don't realize the drawbacks of these types of approaches and how they can impact their training performance, their hormone levels and hormone production, their metabolism, and their body composition. So by going over these often neglected topics within this field and within this industry and these areas of nutrition, I hope to be able to elucidate just how important it is to properly fuel yourself for the goal of physique improvement. So, the first topic that we're going to dive into on today's podcast is the negative effects of skipping meals and creating a state of what's called within day energy deficiency. And this is something I quickly touched on the last podcast, but I'm going to go in detail on today's show. So, within day energy deficiency refers to the concept that you can be eating enough on a daily basis in terms of your total calorie and your macronutrient intake and needs. But if you hit those goals by going, long periods of time during the day in a fasted state, you can predispose yourself to experience a lot of the metabolic and endocrine effects of being in low energy availability, as you're spending a large portion of your day in an energy deficient state, hence the term within day energy deficiency. So this isn't, long-term relative energy deficiency, but within the course of a day, you're putting yourself essentially in these mini energy deficits. And this is something that many do during a fat loss phase to be able to create an energy deficit. But it's even a habit that many who follow a macro-based approach to nutrition do during their maintenance and their building phases so that they can save the majority of their macros until the end of the day. And many within our space have like a pretty simplistic approach to nutrition where they just focus on total calories and macros on a day-to-day scale, which is the foundation to nutrition. However, how we distribute those calories and macros across the day and how we time our nutrient intake, especially around training and our training sessions, is another very important component, which will allow us to maximize our training performance, our body composition progress, and our ability to gain lean muscle mass. And if you really want to maximize your ability to improve, it's not enough to just get enough calories in by the end of the day if you're doing so by going long periods of time throughout the day without eating and then making up for it by eating a ton at one or two meals at the end of the day. So if your within day energy availability isn't accounted for and you're spending large periods of time within your day in a fasted state, especially around training, where you're not taking in nutrients, you're creating a state of within day low energy availability, which can have negative effects on your metabolic rate, your training performance and ability to respond to your training, your recovery capacity, your overall ability to build muscle, your hormone production, your ability to manage your hunger and appetite, and your energy levels and biofeedback. And it's important to remember that throughout the course of your day, your body needs energy and nutrients to run many things. So it needs energy to run its basic physiological functions. It needs energy to fuel exercise and your training performance. It needs energy to stimulate muscle protein synthesis multiple times throughout the day to be in a higher state of anabolism, which contributes to your ability to gain muscle as well as maintain muscle if you're in a fat loss phase. You need energy to sustain higher levels of physical activity because you need energy just to have the drive and the fuel in order to do so. And you need energy and nutrients to maintain proper hormone production. And when you do not, ensure adequate within day energy availability through proper meal timing and nutrient timing, you're essentially spending extended periods of time in an energy deficit, even if by the end of the day, you've negated that deficit by eating more and being in energy balance, aka at maintenance calories. And this state of within day energy deficiency is something that many put themselves in, but don't even realize it. So this can be done through a multitude of habits and behaviors that many in the general population engage in. And you guys might be some people that do this and don't even realize it. So first and foremost, this can be done by training in a fasted state and not utilizing a nutrient timing approach where you properly fuel yourself pre and post workout. So what ends up happening is you enter your training session in a catabolic state due to going to the gym after being fasted overnight during sleep. And then you extend that fasting period and that catabolic state by training in a fasted state, which leads to more muscle protein breakdown and an increased degree of catabolism. This can also occur in those who take an intermittent fasting approach where they skip breakfast and they only eat, say, 1 to 2 times per day during a restricted eating window, which limits the amount of times per day that you can effectively stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which should be done throughout the course of the day. And it can also happen to those who undereat all day to be able to save up their macros and eat the majority of their calories at night. So they go from being in an energy deficit for the vast majority of the day, and then they overeat at night, which can impair your sleep quality amongst many other things. And these types of approaches put you in a state of within-day energy deficiency, which increases the risk of experiencing the negative effects of underfueling and relative energy deficiency, which we discussed on episode 88. So over the last few years, researchers have dug into the negative effects of within-day energy deficiency as compared to spreading out one's calorie intake over the course of the day, and they've found significant detriments and negatives to spending the majority of your day in an underfueled state. So, for example, in a 2018 study, researchers compared the eating habits of active females with menstrual cycle dysfunction with active females who had regular menstrual cycle function. And on a 24-hour timescale, so at the entirety of the day, both groups had equal energy intakes. So their total calorie intakes were equated and matched for. However, when they looked at the differences over a week, they found that those experiencing menstrual cycle dysfunction, like the loss of their menstrual cycle, spent more time throughout the day in a within-day energy deficit, meaning they had longer periods of fasting and underfueling, although they caught up in calories by the end of the day to the other group. And at the end of a week of testing, they found that those with menstrual cycle dysfunction spent more time per day in a catabolic state. And the longer they stayed in the state of energy deficiency, aka fasting, the lower their resting metabolic rate was and their estrogen levels were, and the higher their cortisol levels were. So, despite training and eating the same amount of calories per day as the other group, their lack of appropriate fueling throughout the course of the day led them to being less anabolic and more catabolic and being more likely to experiencing impairments in their menstrual cycle. In another 2018 study, researchers looked at the metabolic perturbations caused by within-day energy deficiency in active males. So we have research on females, but we also have research on males, and it's affecting both sexes. And so even when calories and energy availability were matched within a 24-hour time scale, and these males were all in energy balance, so they were eating at maintenance calories, they found that males who spent a larger portion of the day in an underfueled state by not spreading their energy intake across the day had a larger suppression in their resting metabolic rate, and the more time they spent in an within-day energy deficit, the higher their cortisol levels were and the lower their testosterone to cortisol ratio was, which led them to conclude that within-day energy deficiency was associated with suppressed resting metabolic rate and catabolic markers in these male athletes. In a study from the International Journal of Sports and Exercise Medicine, researchers reviewed the literature on the effects of within-day energy deficiency and then tested it out with active females. And they found that when athletes ate a large dinner but spent most of the day in a state of low energy availability and created a within-day energy deficit due to not fueling themselves around training and during the earlier part of the day, it resulted in an increase in cortisol, a reduction in lean mass and estrogen production, which was associated with lower bone mineral density. And they also found that it dysregulated their appetite and satiety hormones, where ghrelin was higher in those who didn't eat earlier in the day and who saved most of their calories for the evening, which could lead to overeating at night due to experiencing higher levels of hunger and this increased drive to eat, which is associated when we have higher levels of ghrelin, which is our main hunger hormone. And all of these effects were seen despite these females eating at maintenance calories and being weight stable. So it wasn't like they were in a 24-hour calorie deficit. It was just from their within-day energy deficit that they had created early on in the day due to lack of proper meal and nutrient timing around their training. And then in a review on the topic of within-day energy deficiency, researchers summarized some of the effects of spending large periods of the day in an underfueled and fasted state. And within this review, they gave the example of an active individual who consumes a large dinner but little before that, which can cause them to spend most of the day in a significant energy deficit, despite appearing to be in 24-hour energy balance due to hitting their maintenance calorie intake by the end of the day. And such an eating pattern would produce low blood sugar during the day, which would result in an elevation in cortisol production, which is also associated with both low bone mineral density, catabolism or loss of lean mass, and a reduction in estrogen production. And to compound these issues, the low blood sugar is likely to result in hyperinsulinemia or a hyperinsulinemic response at the next eating opportunity, which is associated with increased fat storage. In addition, the appetite-stimulating hormone ghrelin is turned off with normal insulinemia, so normal insulin responses to meals, but it remains elevated when there's a hyperinsulinemic response to a meal, resulting in greater food consumption than normal, which shows how important it is to fuel yourself before and after training and throughout the day, rather than trying to hoard your macros in an effort to have a huge meal at the end of the day. So the next topic we're going to cover is why you want to avoid doing your resistance training sessions in a fasted state, which is something that's extremely common. So when it comes to your resistance training workouts, it's best to avoid going into your training sessions in a fasted state because the process of resistance training involves muscle protein breakdown, which requires you to stimulate muscle protein synthesis to put yourself into a state of positive protein balance, which is what allows you to recover and adapt to your training and is what results in maximizing your ability to gain muscle. And when you train fasted and neglect fueling yourself around the workout, this puts you into a sympathetic dominant state where stress hormones like cortisol stay elevated, which causes more catabolism and more muscle protein breakdown, which is the opposite of what you want to do if your goal is to build muscle. And so the issue with doing your resistance training sessions fasted, which is what many who train early in the day do, is you're entering the gym after already having been in a fasted state for an extended period of time. So you wake up in this catabolic state as you haven't taken any nutrients and especially any protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis since the evening before that you went to bed. And then you train intensely, which elevates cortisol and increases the amount of stress you're putting your body under. And this increase in stress hormones and energy deficiency that you've created from going into the session fasted and burning calories during and after the training session leaves you in a within day energy deficit, meaning that during the early portion of your day, you're in a state of negative energy balance and in a state of low energy availability, meaning that the amount of calories you burn through exercise is higher than the amount of calories you've consumed that day. And when we look at the effects of resistance training fasted, we see that it can hinder strength gains and training performance. So, for example, in a study published earlier this year in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance, they took healthy trained individuals and put them on a progressive resistance training program for the 4 weeks. They split these individuals up into two groups. One group trained every single session fasted, and one group trained in a fed state, which was done to investigate the effects of training time in relation to being in a fasted or a fed state. And the results found that the fed group saw significant improvements in their squat and deadlift performance, whereas the fasted group did not see any significant changes in performance outcomes. The participants also reported that their workouts felt more difficult when training fasted, so their perception of effort was higher than those who trained in a fed state, which may have been why they couldn't progressively overload their training sessions and didn't see any tangible strength gains during this training period and during this training program. And they did not see any differences in hypertrophy outcomes between groups. But seeing as this was just a 4 week training study in trained individuals, it would be really difficult to note a significant difference in such a short time frame. But if you're someone who's training fasted all the time and you're not making strength and performance gains over time, that could limit your ability to achieve progressive overload within your training, which will eventually limit your muscle growth potential. The next thing I want to cover is the most important nutrients you should be focusing on pre-workout. So let's do away with the idea of training fasted every day. If it's once in a while, all well and good. But if it's something you're doing regularly, let's focus on shifting that paradigm and really focusing on fueling yourself pre-workout instead of fasting pre-workout. So if your goal is to improve your body composition, your training performance, maximize your ability to gain muscle and improve your body composition overall, it's much more conducive to train in a fed state and to utilize a nutrient timing approach where you consume nutrients prior and after training to ensure you have enough fuel to perform well during your training sessions and you have enough fuel to accelerate your recovery after. And there are two primary nutrients you should prioritize prior to and around training, especially if you have the goal of maximizing the results you get from your resistance training sessions. So first, you're going to want to have a sufficient dose of protein pre-workout so that you can stimulate muscle protein synthesis and anabolism and elevate the levels of amino acids in your blood so that you have adequate amino acid availability. So the first priority is to go into your training sessions in what's called a state of hyperaminoacidemia, which is accomplished by consuming some pre-workout protein or essential amino acids so that you're not going into a training session in a catabolic state, which will only be made more catabolic through training, which increases both cortisol and muscle protein breakdown / degradation. The second nutrient you're going to want to prioritize pre-workout is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are the preferred fuel source of the muscle as it provides us with muscle glycogen and of the brain and nervous system as it provides these systems with blood glucose. And seeing as high intensity forms of exercise, like resistance training or anaerobic activities, this relies on endogenous carb sources, specifically the glycogen stored in your muscles, to fuel muscular contractions and high intensity efforts. So carbs are important to consume pre-workout because if you go into a training session in a glycogen depleted state, such as if you go into training in a fasted state or in a state of low carbohydrate availability, it can actually hinder your training performance and your overall training volume as a result. So including carbs into your pre-workout meal is even more important when you're fasted or you're in a dieting phase because your glycogen levels are already lower in both these states, which can decrease your training performance in the gym. So eating carbs pre-workout is especially helpful for those who train early in the AM or who are in a fat loss phase where their calorie intake is lower overall. The next topic I want to cover is how to approach pre-workout fueling if you train early in the morning. And this is something I personally do, but it's also one situation I often encounter with new clients. And they'll come to me and they tell me that they've been doing the resistance training fasted, especially because they train in the morning. So this is especially common in the female clients who come to me, the vast majority of whom have been training fasted for an extended period of time prior to us starting to work together. And oftentimes they tell me that they do this for one of three reasons. The first reason being they believe they'll burn more fat as a result of training in a fasted state. The second reason is because they follow an intermittent fasting approach. So due to training early, they have to wait multiple hours after training to eat to stay within their restricted eating window. Or the last one is they don't know what to eat pre-workout, so they just skip the meal in and of itself. And what many don't realize is that training fasted not only impacts your training performance, but it also delays the recovery and muscle rebuilding process because of the fact that you haven't consumed protein since the day before, so you don't have amino acids readily available in the blood. So you have to wait until after finishing your session to consume a protein source and have that protein source digest and absorb to start the process of muscle repair and recovery. So going into training fasted not only leaves you going into a session in a suboptimal state from a fuel availability and a muscle building perspective, but it also leaves you going to sessions not optimally hydrated, as carbohydrates help to increase hydration. And if you're not well fueled, what ends up happening is, when you go in fasted, your liver glycogen has already been depleted from the overnight fast, which can cause you to burn through your energy resources and fuel sources quicker due to not having consumed carbs prior to the session. Also, although many believe that training fasted increases their ability to burn fat, I think it's really important to realize that there's a big difference between fat oxidation, so fat burning, and actual fat loss. So you may burn more session or more fat in a session if you're doing low intensity activities like cardio or walking fasted, which has been shown in studies. So for instance, there's a research study looking at fasted versus fed cardio, and this was done by Brad Schoenfeld and Alan Aragon, and they did find that if you went into a fasted cardio session, so low intensity cardio, you will burn more fat in that session itself if you go into a fasted state. However, when we look at the large body of evidence, a 2014 meta-analysis on substrate oxidation and fuel use during fasted exercise found that fat oxidation actually increased more after exercise when participants trained in a fed state rather than when participants trained fasted. They also found that after individuals trained fasted, there was a reduction in fat oxidation, aka fat burning, for both men and women. But the rates of fat oxidation were blunted more significantly in women who trained fasted. So when it comes to training fasted, research finds that females respond better from a training perspective from training in a fed state, both in terms of fueling performance and facilitating recovery, both of which lead to greater training adaptations, greater muscle growth, and body composition improvements. So having my clients properly fueled prior to training is something I really try to focus on, especially with my female clients, as they often have been training fasted and not realizing that it's actually limiting their potential to make progress. So by having these female clients make the switch from training fasted to training after a pre-workout meal, I found they're able to perform better in the gym. They feel better both during and after their training sessions and are able to make better body composition progress as a result of being able to progress their training performance more and recover more effectively and efficiently. Going into training in a fed and fueled state is especially important and beneficial for the women I work with, as many of them are dealing with much higher levels of stress from their careers, from running a family, and caring for either their partner and or their children than a lot of the men that I work with. And when I run their labs, the average female client that comes to me has much higher cortisol levels and much higher stress levels than the average male client that I work with does. So if I was to continue having them train fasted, it's only going to elevate and compound this stress and cortisol production because they're already in a catabolic state due to the overnight fast where they haven't ingested any nutrients. And then they'd be going into the gym with already elevated cortisol levels, which can further muscle protein breakdown and limit their recovery capacity. So my main focus with the women I work with who have been training fasted prior to us working together is to get them to at least consume a sufficient dose of protein before training to switch them from this catabolic state to a more anabolic state due to having stimulated muscle protein synthesis, and then also ensuring that they eat a meal after training. Because another trend that I've noticed with females is they tend to forego eating for hours after training. So they stay in the state of muscle breakdown for longer than necessary, which isn't doing their body composition, their muscle recovery, and their muscle gain goals any benefit whatsoever. Now, for those in the audience who do train early in the morning before work or before you need to get your kids ready for school, or you're one of those who skip a pre workout meal because you don't know what to eat, or you just can't stomach a full meal that early, an easy alternative is to use liquid nutrition or quick, easily digested meals to ensure you're well fueled, yet you aren't bogged down with food prior to training. So this can be as simple and easy as having a protein shake, which can be consumed by itself, or with something like a piece of fruit, or with some liquid carbs like highly branched cyclic dextrin mixed in it. For those of you who are big coffee lovers, you can get your caffeine fix in by throwing a scoop or two of whey into that cup of coffee. And honestly, you could do like this French vanilla mix. There's French vanilla protein. You throw that in with black coffee. It tastes phenomenal. And this is something that I've utilized many mornings because I do train at a very early time period. And these are all quick and convenient meals to make sure that you have enough fuel for your training, but they don't require much time, much effort, or energy, and they won't have you entering the gym with a full stomach. The reason I'm so big on ensuring clients have protein prior to training is because we have a large body of evidence that shows that this is beneficial from a metabolic, a body composition, and a performance perspective. One benefit of having a pre workout meal, especially a protein centered meal or a shake, is it increases the amount of calories you burn in the training session itself and after the training session has been finished. So in a randomized control trial that was done out of University of North Carolina, they took active females and had them do a resistance training session where one session was done with whey protein pre-workout and then compared it to another session that was done with the same amount of calories coming from carbs pre-workout. They also tested both pre-workout meals prior to a session of high-intensity interval training, cardio, on different days to test the effects protein and carbs had on higher intensity cardio workouts. They found that in both of these training conditions, taking in protein pre-resistance training or pre-hit training led to significant increase in the amount of calories and fat that these women burn during and after exercise. So if you're training fasted to burn more fat or to burn more calories, you're actually missing out on the metabolic advantage of having protein pre-workout. And this is because it's going to help you actually burn more fat and burn more calories if you actually ingest protein prior to training. Now, another topic I want to cover is how fasting impacts both fat loss and muscle retention, because there's a lot of misconceptions about this and a lot of claims out on the internet by those that are in camps that really advocate for these type of approaches that the data just doesn't align with. So, a dietary approach that has become especially popular within the last few years are fasting approaches, including intermittent fasting, which is where you compress your eating window into a short period of time, usually lasting 8 hours or less. And I often get a lot of questions regarding intermittent fasting and its effects on fat loss and muscle mass. When it comes to comparing intermittent fasting and continuous calorie restriction in a regular eating window and their effects on fat loss, there was just a 2022 study that was released where researchers conducted a 12-month diet intervention with almost 140 participants to compare the effects of following a calorie restricted diet with a normal eating window compared to an 8-hour intermittent fasting window. They analyzed participants in both groups to see the amount of body weight loss, body fat loss, their BMI, their waist circumference, and their improvements in metabolic markers. And when comparing the results and improvements from baseline between the group using an intermittent fasting approach, which had that 8-hour window, versus the daily calorie restriction approach using a regular eating window, they found no significant differences between the results individuals got using either approach. So regardless of whether a participant used a compressed feeding window of 8 hours or less or a regular eating window, there was no advantage to either approach in terms of the total amount of body weight and body fat they lost and the improvement in markers of insulin sensitivity and blood lipids. So what the overall body of literature on intermittent fasting finds is that fasting has not been shown to improve fat loss or metabolic health markers any more than a calorie deficit itself. But there are multiple studies that have shown that you are more predisposed towards muscle loss using fasting approaches while dieting, whether that be using intermittent fasting or alternate day fasting, as compared to eating over a regular daily eating window. So, for example, In a 2021 study, researchers conducted a randomized control trial to isolate the effects of fasting and energy restriction on weight loss in lean adults. And in order to test this out, they took young, healthy subjects or lean healthy subjects and put them into one of three groups. One group maintained a deficit using continuous calorie restriction, where they ate throughout the course of the day but maintained an energy deficit. Another group maintained the same calorie deficit as the continuous dieting group, but they used a fasting approach to create that deficit. And the last group used a fasting approach, but they ate at maintenance calories. And one of the goals of the study was to see if there were any unique and independent effects to fasting, which would have been seen in the fasting group eating at in a deficit and the fasting group eating at maintenance, but not in the continuous calorie restriction group, who is eating throughout the course of the day and wasn't going any extended periods of time without eating. And prior to the study, they monitored their energy intake and physical activity levels for 4 weeks to find out their baseline calorie intake and expenditure, and made sure that they were weight stable prior to starting the study. The results found that both the continuous dieting and fasting groups that were in a deficit lost about the same amount of body weight. However, those in the continuous calorie restriction group lost significantly more fat mass and preserved more fat-free mass than the fasting group, which lost less body fat, but they lost more fat-free mass, which included muscle tissue. The continuous group lost almost all of their weight from fat mass alone, whereas the fasting group lost about 50% of their weight from fat mass and then 50% of their weight from fat-free mass, which included muscle, which is not what we want from a body composition improvement perspective. And this could be due to a multitude of reasons. So it could be due to less than optimal protein distribution. It could be due to an increase in catabolism and muscle protein breakdown that comes along with long periods of fasting and eating in a limited time window. They also found and saw that physical activity energy expenditure was significantly reduced in the fasting group as compared to the continuous calorie restriction group. Then this past year, there was a study where they split males in two groups and looked at the differences in muscle protein synthesis rates and muscle mass between an intermittent fasting group, which they had eaten an 8-hour eating window, and a regular eating window group, which ate from morning until evening. They put both groups on a calorie matched diet and provided all other meals to them for a period of 10 days. So the only difference between groups was that one group ate all their calories within a restricted eating window, and one group ate their calories throughout the course of the day. And they found that both groups lost the same amount of weight, but despite calories and protein being equated between groups, they found that the intermittent fasting group lost more of their weight from lean mass, whereas the regular eating window group lost more fat mass and body fat. So when it comes to fat loss and muscle retention outcomes, fueling yourself throughout the day has more favorable effects on body composition outcomes, as it generally yields greater fat mass loss and greater lean mass or muscle retention than fasting does. Right, so the next thing, just to really go off of that, is I want to go through why you should be eating protein around training to maximize muscle growth and muscle retention. So one of the main reasons as to why we may see less muscle growth and worse muscle maintenance with fasting approaches is due to the fact that eating in a compressed eating window limits the amount of protein feedings you can get in per day. And it also causes you to spend elongated periods of time in a catabolic state where anabolism isn't being stimulated through protein ingestion, which is known to elevate muscle protein synthesis levels. And muscle growth, if we think about it from a mechanistic basis, or what we need to accomplish to actually accomplish the goal of muscle growth, we need it so that our rates of muscle protein synthesis consistently exceed our rates of muscle protein breakdown over a prolonged period of time, meaning we spend more time in a state of anabolism where we're building muscle than in a state of catabolism where we're breaking muscle tissue down. Now, muscle protein synthesis is an energy intensive process. So it not only requires nutrients, specifically protein and amino acids, but there's also a time limit to how long we can stimulate and keep it elevated for before we'll need to consume more protein to kickstart the process again. So it's not like you can just eat protein one time per day and keep muscle protein synthesis rates maximally elevated all day long, nor can you make up for not consuming protein during your fasting window by over consuming protein later in the day. We can stimulate the process of muscle protein synthesis, which is needed to build and maintain muscle, through two main methods. So this includes engaging in progressive resistance training and through the ingestion of protein or essential amino acids. And so after resistance exercise, muscle protein synthesis is stimulated, but so is muscle protein breakdown. Therefore, net protein balance remains negative. So in order to get into a state of positive net protein balance, we need to consume a quality source of essential amino acids, which can be done by taking in a sufficient serving of quality protein. So combining frequent protein feedings with resistance training has a synergistic effect to increase protein synthesis and shift us into a state of positive protein balance to a greater extent than just training alone or just eating protein alone. And the largest and most robust stimulus is induced by resistance training, but consuming protein around training can amplify our protein synthetic response and elevation around training. And depending on your training age and how hard you train, resistance exercise can increase muscle protein synthesis levels for between 24 to 48 hours, but we can further increase that stimulus by ingesting an adequate dose of protein multiple times per day, which is what we want to do to maximize our muscle growth, as muscle hypertrophy is the result of the accumulation of successive periods of positive protein balance after exercise when protein is consumed. Another topic I want to touch on is how fasting impacts females, because this is something I don't think gets enough play. And I find that a lot of women that come to me, they're having issues, whether that be hormonally, it could be endocrinology, it could be within their menstrual cycle, it could be their biofeedback. And a lot of them have either taken fasting approaches in the past or are utilizing fasting approaches when they come to me. And one of the main issues with fasting is it can lead you to being in a state of within day low energy availability, because the compressed window causes you to be in a state of low energy availability for a large portion of the day, which can have negative impacts on your training performance and training adaptations, your recovery capacity, your energy levels, and your hormone levels. And this type of approach also leads you to having a higher risk for developing relative energy deficiency. Fasting also tends to be more disruptive and deleterious to a female's physiology, as research finds that women are more susceptible to the negative effects of low energy availability. So this within day energy deficit signals to the hypothalamus in the brain that there's not enough nutrients and energy available in the body. And it causes adaptations like a decrease in thyroid hormone production and a decrease in metabolism as a result, in order to conserve energy, aka calories. So this could lead you to experiencing greater adaptations during a deficit as a result. So in active females who train fasting and or use fasting approaches, we see a higher likelihood of them developing things like relative energy deficiency and other hormonal issues. So for example, there's research that finds just 3 days of fasting in normal weight women and 5 days of being in a very aggressive energy deficit where energy availability was cut in half has led to a disruption of luteinizing hormone pulsatility in females. And this disruption of LH pulsatility has been shown to be a future predictor of menstrual cycle disruption and amenorrhea, aka the loss of the menstrual cycle for 3 months or longer. And this is due to the fact that when our brains receive a signal that there's not enough energy available and fuel coming in, it starts to downregulate other processes, especially for females. So this, a couple examples of this is it decreases LH pulse, which impacts the sex hormones like estrogen production. It decreases thyroid hormone production, including T3, which is the most impactful hormone for our metabolic rate. And it can ultimately lead to disruptions and interruptions in menstrual cycle function, which is why it's so important for females to focus on fueling themselves around training and throughout the course of the day. Now, another component with both fasted training and of fasting approaches like intermittent fasting is there is a component where people skip breakfast. And so I want to go over some of the negatives or the drawbacks that can come along with the act of consistently skipping breakfast on a regular basis. So ever since approaches like intermittent fasting became popular, people have started looking at breakfast as a meal which should be skipped. So many within the nutrition space have followed suit with this, which has even led to mainstream media sources like people like Dr. Oz even to demonize breakfast as though skipping it will benefit you. And when we look at breakfast skipping, this is a method that can help you reduce calorie intake, but it has also been shown to have some drawbacks to it in terms of reducing physical activity levels, total daily energy expenditure, and training performance later in the day. So, for example, there was a series of randomized control trials done by Dr. James Batts at the University of Bath a few years ago, where they compared groups that ate breakfast and then those who skipped breakfast to see how it affected 24-hour energy balance. And over the series of 2 studies, they recruited a group of lean individuals and a group of obese participants, and randomly assigned them to either eat breakfast every day or to skip breakfast and fast in the morning for 6 weeks. The breakfast group was simply given a calorie target to hit, but since this was a free living study, they allowed them to self-select what they had for breakfast, and the majority of them ended up having a high-carb breakfast each and every morning where they just hit their macronutrient allotments. And so they found that those in the breakfast group increased their levels of physical activity across the whole day, especially in the morning, as compared to the breakfast skipping group. And the average increase in physical activity increased their total daily energy expenditure by more than 440 calories per day in the breakfast eating group as compared to the breakfast skipping group. So skipping breakfast could potentially reduce your physical activity levels and the total amount of calories that you burn per day. Other research has looked at the effect of skipping breakfast and what that has on physical activity levels throughout the course of the day. And they've described this as having a compensatory mechanism to defend against the energy deficit that has been created by skipping a mealtime in which you'd usually be taking in nutrients. And thus, your body would have more calories to expend and burn. So I advise those out there to not skip breakfast thinking it's going to lead to a greater deficit, as you may just compensate and actually subconsciously reduce your energy expenditure and your NEAT levels and offset the calories that you didn't eat early in the day due to being less active. And if you are going to fast in the morning, just be aware that your energy levels may be lower and you're less likely to be physically active. So it's important to be aware of that and to try to make up for that. Then, in a 2021 study published in the European Journal of Sports Science, they found that skipping breakfast impairs training performance later in the day. And in this study, they compared two groups, one that was fed breakfast and one that skipped breakfast. However, both groups' total calorie and macronutrient intake for the day was the same heading into the evening training session, as they had those in the breakfast skipping group make up for the calories that they didn't eat when skipping breakfast by eating more calories at their lunch meal. Despite the equal amount of total calories in their diet, the breakfast skipping group had 3% less total power output and a higher perception of effort during the workout itself than the group that had breakfast. A 2015 study also found similar results when they had male participants come into the lab on two occasions. In one occasion, they fed them breakfast, and the other, they had them skip breakfast. And then 9 hours later, they put them through a training session to assess the impact that consuming a meal early in the day has on training performance later that evening. And they found that the total amount of work completed during the exercise session was 4.5 or 4.5% greater after breakfast than it was when those same participants skipped breakfast. So we see that skipping breakfast can not only lower physical activity levels in NEAT, but it can also impact your training performance. Another thing I want to go through is, let's go from the drawbacks of skipping breakfast to the benefits of starting your day off in a well-fueled state. Although I wouldn't say that eating breakfast is necessary for every single person, I do think that starting your day off in a well-fueled state is advantageous and beneficial, especially if your goal is to maximize your training performance, your energy output, your body composition, and your ability to gain muscle. When we wake up in the morning, this is when our cortisol levels are usually at their highest due to the cortisol awakening response that helps us wake up. And after waking from an overnight fast, we're already in a catabolic state. So this is why eating a protein-containing meal within a few hours of waking is beneficial, as it'll stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which will promote anabolism to lower the anti-catabolic effects of cortisol and reduce muscle protein breakdown levels. And research from the field of chrononutrition has found that our insulin sensitivity levels are generally greatest in the morning, and then they fall throughout the day. So, for example, a 2018 study found that insulin sensitivity levels are 25% higher at breakfast than when eating that exact same meal at night. And pancreatic beta cell function is 15% higher in the morning as compared to in the evening. Our glucose tolerance, aka our carbohydrate tolerance, is also much higher in the morning. So our ability to handle carbs, dispose of them, and to regulate our blood sugar levels are much better in the morning at breakfast than they are later in the day. We also see something called the second meal effect, which is when we consume a meal within a few hours of waking. So research has found that if we consume either a high protein and or carb containing meal in the morning, our glucose response to lunch is better and it's improved. And we have improved blood sugar control in response to that meal as compared to if we fasted throughout the morning, as research finds that when we skip breakfast, we experience a higher glucose spike at lunch than if we had breakfast prior to that same meal. This also allows us to be more insulin sensitive, so our muscles will take up more glucose without needing as much insulin. So eating breakfast is beneficial from a metabolic health perspective. And this is why I encourage my clients to start their day off with a nutrient-dense breakfast, or just a meal. It doesn't have to be categorized as breakfast. This doesn't have to be cereal and stuff, but it's a meal to start your day off with on a good note. And this is especially important and something I especially encourage on training days, because eating breakfast has been found to be correlated to lower body weights and lower BMI. It's been linked to higher levels of NEAT and energy expenditure and calories burned across the day. And it's also been shown to help with appetite regulation and hunger management. We also see in observational research that regular breakfast consumers have been shown to be less likely to be overweight as compared to those who skip breakfast. And eating breakfast is also a habit that the vast majority of successful weight loss maintainers engage in. So, for example, the National Weight Control Registry, which is a large database which provides information and data about the strategies used by successful weight loss maintainers to achieve and maintain long-term weight loss, finds that 78% of those who have lost a significant amount of body fat and kept it off for a significant period of time report eating breakfast on a daily basis. What's interesting about this National Weight Controlled Registry is in order to be a part of it, you have to have lost at least 30 pounds and kept it off for a year. But if you actually look at the average data on these individuals, the members of this registry have lost on average 66 pounds and kept it off for over 5 years. So they're a part of that 5% of rare individuals who can lose weight and lose a significant amount of weight and keep it off for a substantial period of time. Another benefit of eating breakfast within a few hours of waking is that it helps to regulate your appetite and manage hunger. And as a coach, I've found that many new clients whom have come to me and have been trying to use breakfast skipping approaches to elicit weight loss often tell me they tend to overeat the evening, in the evening after work due to being ravenously hungry by the end of the day. Yet, when I had them start including a satiating meal at the start of the day, they find themselves less likely to overeat at night. Also, if we think about any time that you or someone you know has went way over their calorie intake or is engaged in essentially a binge, this usually never happens in the morning. This usually always occurs at night. And when I've had clients report that they've overeaten, it's usually happened after they've decided to skip a meal or they've unnecessarily over restricted their food intake earlier in the day to be able to save and hoard macros for later. But then they find themselves way hungry later in the evening. And often, if this is combined with, say, a stressful workday, or a stressful day with their partner, or they get into an argument, or whatever it may be, they often find themselves looking to food for comfort. And this often leads to a situation where they overeat and blow their calorie budget for the day. What's interesting is I know that for some, they report that skipping breakfast and utilizing intermittent fasting helps them control their calorie intake. And I'm not disputing that. But I often hear people who are advocates of this approach saying it's better for appetite control, but that's not what the data finds. So this year in 2023, a systematic review and meta-analysis was done to investigate whether intermittent fasting has favorable and more significant and beneficial effects on appetite as compared to continuous caloric restriction. And we hear a lot of claims about how intermittent fasting and eating in a shorter window makes appetite control easier. But this was actually the first systematic review and meta-analysis to quantify the effects of intermittent fasting on appetite when controlled to continuous calorie restriction. And so within the systematic review and meta-analysis, they looked at the differences in appetite, hunger, fullness, desire to eat, and overall food consumption. And when analyzing 17 randomized control trials with over 1,100 participants, they found no clear evidence that intermittent fasting approaches affect hunger, fullness, desire to eat, or prospective food consumption differently than continuous energy restriction interventions. They also looked at 5 studies that measured adherence levels in the intermittent fasting group compared to the continuous calorie restriction group. And throughout the 5 studies, found better adherence with the continuous calorie restriction group, and 2 found the same percentage of adherence between groups. So it's not like an intermittent fasting approach makes it easier to adhere to. Also, when it comes to appetite control and our ability to manage hunger during a diet, research finds that eating more of our calories earlier in the day actually helps with appetite regulation as compared to eating more of our calories in the evening. So, this is something that if you are skipping breakfast and you're taking no nutrients in the beginning of the day, you might be doing your ability to regulate your appetite a disservice. So, for example, in a randomized control trial from Root at Collins conducted last year, they looked at the effects of nutrient timing and calorie distribution on appetite and hunger in males and females. And in this study, they had all participants consume the same amount of calories and follow the same macronutrient split, which is 30% of calories from protein, 35% carbs, and 35% of energy from fat, with all meals supplied to them by the lab. But they had one group which ate more of their calories early in the day, and the other group ate more of their calories later in the day. And they had each group follow this diet for dietary setup for 4 weeks, and then they had a 1 week washout. And then what they did was they switched them to the opposite nutrient timing setup. So the early loaded group switched to eating more calories later in the evening, and the evening loaded group that followed that for the first 4 weeks switched to eating more of their calories earlier in the day, while following the exact same diet and macronutrient setup, so that each participant could act as their own control as they tested 2 different approaches to nutrient timing and compared it within these same exact individuals. And they found that there was no difference in weight loss outcomes between groups by the end of the study. But that's because they both ate the same amount of calories in both conditions. Now, what they did find was that when participants were on the earlier nutrient times diet setup, they reported significantly lower hunger throughout the day, which led the authors to suggest that morning loaded intake, which they actually refer to as a big breakfast, may assist with compliance to a weight loss regimen through a greater suppression of appetite. They also found that participants had lower ghrelin levels, which is our main hunger hormone, when they were on the early nutrient timing approach, which they started off, their day with a solid meal. There's also fascinating research and a fascinating set of studies by a researcher named Daniela Jakubowicz, which have all been done on women and have looked at the effects of nutrient and meal timing on weight loss, metabolic health, and hormone health. And much of her studies compare the effects of front loading calories earlier in the day, so just like this Rita Collins study did, as compared to backloading calories at the last meal of the day. And she has multiple studies on women which have shown significant benefits. So, for example, in a 2013 study, her research group found that when women front loaded most of their calories earlier in the day as compared to saving calories and hoarding their macros to eat more at night, the females saw a greater reduction in body fat, a larger reduction in waist circumference, and better increases in insulin sensitivity as compared to the calorie backloaded group, despite both groups eating the same amount of calories during the fat loss diet. Then, in a 2012 study, her lab found that when dieters front loaded their calorie intake with a high protein breakfast, they had greater suppression of ghrelin, not only during the fat loss phase itself, but their ghrelin level stayed suppressed in the post weight loss period as compared to the backloaded group who saw greater increases in ghrelin. And then in another one of her studies, she looked at the effects of meal timing on insulin resistance and hyperandrogenism in lean women suffering from PCOS and found that the breakfast group saw greater improvements in hyperandrogenism, insulin sensitivity, and ovulation rate. And this is actually a strategy that I've used with women that I've worked with who have PCOS. Because the vast majority of women with PCOS, although it's not a diagnostic criteria of PCOS, the vast majority of them have insulin resistance. And this is one of the things that they're suffering with. So this is an intervention I found to improve insulin sensitivity, not only because we have research specifically on those with PCOS, but also we see that there's a greater increase in insulin sensitivity early in the day as compared to later in the day. So overall, if you're looking to improve your body composition, your muscle gain outcomes, and help to manage your hunger and satiety levels, I'd encourage you to fuel yourself early in the day, as this can be a simple strategy that can help us keep our activity levels higher during a diet, which can increase energy expenditure and can really help with appetite regulation and hunger management, which is important as the key to getting lean and staying lean is being able to manage appetite and suppress hunger, as hunger is the primary reason why people fall off their diet and fail to see the results that they're looking for. As always, guys, thank you so much for listening to the show and for your continued support. If you need anything from me whatsoever, you guys can find me on Instagram, which is at @BrandonDeCruz_, or through my email, which is bdecruzfitness@gmail.com. And also, I would love it if you guys could remember to follow the show, whether that be on Spotify or iTunes, leave us a review on iTunes, and also please do share the episodes, on your story, so that we can continue to reach more listeners and have a positive ripple effect where we're able to help more and more people look better, feel better, and function better. As always, guys, I hope you have a phenomenal week and Happy New Year.